The studio lights blazed hot as Whoopi Goldberg leaned back in her chair, her signature laugh already building in her chest. Today's show was supposed to be different. Instead of the usual celebrity interviews or political debates, they had arranged something unusual, a live demonstration by a member of the Queen's Guard from England. The audience applauded as a tall figure in the iconic red uniform and bearskin hat marched onto the stage. His movements were precise, mechanical almost, and his face remained completely expressionless behind the black strap of his hat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whoopi announced to the audience, "we have something special today. Please welcome Sergeant James Wellington of Her Majesty's Grenadier Guards." Whoopi's co-hosts exchanged glances. Joy Behar whispered something to Sarah Haynes, who stifled a giggle. The sight of the motionless guard standing at perfect attention in the middle of their casual talk show set seemed almost comical. "So, Sergeant Wellington," Whoopi began, her voice already carrying a hint of amusement, "I have to ask, do you ever break character, ever crack a smile?" The guard remained silent, staring straight ahead. Still nothing. The guard's discipline was absolute. "I mean, come on," Whoopi continued, her smile widening. "This is television. We're all friends here. You can relax a little." The audience began to murmur. Some laughed nervously. Others seemed impressed by his unwavering commitment to protocol. "You know what?" Whoopi said, turning to her co-hosts. "I bet we can get him to break. What do you think, ladies?" Joy Behar leaned forward. "Oh, this should be good. Whoopi's about to test the limits of British Reserve." The tension in the studio was building. What had started as a simple demonstration was turning into something else entirely. The guard remained perfectly still, but there was something in his posture, a slight stiffening, that suggested he was aware of what was coming. The audience was fully engaged now. This wasn't just a talk show segment anymore. It was becoming a battle of wills between one of America's most outspoken personalities and the embodiment of British military discipline. "Sergeant," Whoopi said, standing up and walking closer to him, "I've got to know what's the most ridiculous thing that's ever happened to you while on duty." The guard's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. "You know what I think," Whoopi said, returning to her chair but keeping her eyes locked on the guard. "I think this whole thing is just an act. I think underneath that fancy uniform, you're just a regular guy who probably watches our show." The guard's jaw tightened slightly, but he held his position. Whoopi circled the guard slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Come on, Sergeant, off the record, between friends. What's the funniest thing a tourist has ever said to you?" "Aha," Whoopi exclaimed, pointing at him. "I saw that. You looked at me. You're human after all." But the guard had already resumed his rigid stare straight ahead, as if nothing had happened. For the first time, the guard's eyes moved. Just for a split second, they shifted to look directly at Whoopi. The audience caught it and gasped. The studio was electric with anticipation. Everyone could sense that something was building, that this polite demonstration was about to become something much more intense. Whoopi's eyes gleamed with mischief as she settled back into her chair. The guard's momentary glance had given her all the ammunition she needed. She was no longer just hosting a demonstration. She was hunting for a crack in what seemed like an impenetrable wall of discipline. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the audience, "we have ourselves a challenge here. Sergeant Wellington thinks he can outlast me, but I've been in this business for decades. I've broken tougher nuts than this." "Poor man," Whoopi scoffed. "This is what he signed up for." "Right, Sergeant. You knew what you were getting into when you agreed to come on American television." The guard remained motionless, but something in his breathing pattern had changed. It was subtle, but Whoopi caught it. She was getting to him. The audience laughed and applauded, feeding off her energy. Joy Behar shook her head with a knowing smile. "Whoopi, you're terrible. Leave the poor man alone." A few audience members chuckled, but others began to look uncomfortable. The guard's hands, which had been perfectly still at his sides, now showed the slightest tremor. "I mean seriously," Whoopi pressed on. "What's the point of all this? Standing perfectly still for hours? It's 2024, not 1824. Don't you think it's time to modernize? You know what I love about you British folks?" Whoopi continued, warming up to her subject. "You're so polite, so proper, but I bet underneath all that stiff upper lip nonsense, You're dying to tell us what you really think about standing in the rain for hours while tourists take selfies with you. No, Whoopi cut her off. I'm genuinely curious. Sergeant Wellington, help me understand. What goes through your mind when you're standing there like a statue? Do you think about your family, your girlfriend, or are you just completely empty up there? Shara Haynes tried to intervene. Whoopi, maybe we should. The guard's eye twitched. It was barely visible, but Whoopi caught it immediately. Oh, there it is again, she exclaimed, pointing at him. Did everyone see that? His eye twitched. We're getting somewhere. The audience was divided now. Some were laughing and cheering Whoopi on, while others looked concerned about the direction this was taking. The guard's commanding officer, who had been standing quietly in the wings, stepped forward slightly, but stopped when the guard made an almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. You know what I think? Whoopi said, standing up again and moving closer to the guard. I think you're actually enjoying this. I think being made fun of on American television is the most excitement you've had in months. Is it hot in here, Sergeant? Whoopi asked sweetly, or are you just feeling the pressure? Because I can keep this up all day. I've got nothing but time. The guard's breathing was definitely different now. His chest rose and fell more noticeably, and a thin line of perspiration had appeared on his forehead beneath the bearskin hat. The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing that something significant was building. Even the camera operators seemed to lean in closer, anticipating what might happen next. Tell you what, Whoopi said, returning to her chair but keeping her eyes fixed on the guard. I'll make you a deal. If you can stand there for the rest of the show without reacting to anything I say, I'll publicly apologize and donate to any military charity you name. But Whoopi continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. If you so much as smile or frown or even blink too much, then you have to answer one question. Just one, honestly. The guard's eyes flickered again. The tension in the studio was palpable. Everyone understood that this had moved beyond entertainment into something more personal, more challenging. The guard remained perfectly still, but everyone could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Whoopi could see the battle raging behind the guard's eyes, duty versus human nature, training versus instinct. She had pushed countless celebrities to their limits over the years, but this was different. This man represented something bigger than himself. Tick-tock, Sergeant, she said softly, glancing at her watch. Clock's running. We've got about 20 minutes left in the show. Joy Behar leaned over to whisper to Whoopi, maybe we should wrap this up. He looks like he's really struggling. The guard's knuckles were white now, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The audience could see the strain he was under, and the mood in the studio began to shift. What had started as entertainment is becoming something uncomfortable to watch. She stood up and began pacing in front of him, her movements deliberate and predatory. You know what I'm curious about? How does it feel to be a living museum piece? A tourist attraction? Do you ever wonder if your life has any real meaning beyond standing around looking pretty for cameras? But Whoopi was in her element now. She had found her target and wasn't about to let go. Struggling. He's fine. Aren't you, Sergeant? This is what you train for, right? Discipline under pressure. The guard's jaw muscle jumped. It was barely visible, but Whoopi caught it immediately. The audience was completely silent now. Even the camera crew seemed uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. The guard's commanding officer took another step forward, his face showing concern. There, she exclaimed, pointing at him. Did you see that? His jaw moved. We're getting close, people. You know what I think your problem is? Whoopi continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. You think you're special. You think that uniform makes you better than everyone else. But really, you're just a man in a funny hat who gets paid to stand around and look serious. The guard's breathing was shallow now, and his hands were trembling slightly. The audience could see that he was reaching his breaking point, and many looked away, uncomfortable with witnessing what felt like psychological torture. Something changed in the guard's eyes. The careful blankness was replaced by something sharper, more focused. He was no longer just enduring her attacks. He was listening, processing, and perhaps preparing to respond. I mean, let's be honest, Whoopi pressed on. What kind of grown man chooses to spend his life playing dress-up and pretending to be a toy soldier? What does that say about you as a person? Cat got your tongue? Whoopi taunted. Or are you just too scared to speak up? Too trained to be a puppet to have your own thoughts? The guard's eyes closed for just a moment, and when they opened, something had fundamentally changed. The blank stare was gone, replaced by an intensity that made several audience members gasp. Still nothing, Whoopi said, but her voice carried less confidence now. She had seen the change in him too. Come on, Sergeant. Don't you have anything to say for yourself? Any ends of your meaningless little life? The guard's mouth opened slightly, and for a moment it seemed like he might speak. The entire studio held its breath. But then he closed his mouth and resumed his rigid posture, though the fire in his eyes remained. You know what? Whoopi said, her frustration beginning to show. I'm getting bored. This is like trying to have a conversation with a wax figure. At least wax figures have more personality. The guard's eyes followed her movement, and for the first time his head turned slightly to track her progress. It was a small movement, but it represented a complete break from his training. She turned to address the audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've established that our friend here is either incredibly disciplined or completely empty upstairs. Either way, it's not much of a show. The audience gasped. Even Whoopi stopped mid-sentence, realizing that something significant had just happened. The guard's slight head movement had changed everything. The perfect statue had shown a human reaction, and everyone in the studio could feel the shift in power dynamics. Whoopi's eyes lit up with triumph, but there was something else in the guard's expression now, something that should have warned her to be careful. Well, well, she said slowly, turning back to face him. Now we're getting somewhere. There we go, Whoopi exclaimed, clapping her hands together. He moved. He actually moved. Ladies and gentlemen, we have officially broken through the famous British Reserve. How does it feel, Sergeant? Whoopi asked, moving closer to him again. To finally be human instead of a robot. To show some actual emotion. The guard's eyes met hers directly for the first time, and what she saw there gave her pause. There was no embarrassment, no defeat. Instead, there was something that looked almost like pity. The audience applauded uncertainly, but the guard's reaction was unexpected. Instead of looking embarrassed or defeated, he seemed almost relieved. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and his breathing became more natural. You know what? Whoopi continued, trying to regain her momentum. I think you owe me that answer now. You moved, you reacted, you broke your precious discipline. So here's my question. What do you really think about people like me, Americans who make fun of your traditions? The guard was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. The studio was completely silent, everyone waiting for his response. Even the technical crew had stopped moving, afraid to break the tension. Is that really what you want to know? He asked finally, his voice quiet but carrying clearly throughout the studio. His accent was crisp, educated, and there was something in his tone that made Whoopi take a step back. This wasn't the voice of a broken man or an embarrassed soldier. This was the voice of someone who had been waiting for this moment. The guard nodded slowly, as if he had expected this question. I think, he said carefully, that you've made a fundamental mistake about what just happened here. Yes, Whoopi said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. That's what I want to know. What do you really think? What do you mean? Whoopi asked, her bravado beginning to crack. He paused, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. The audience was hanging on his every word. You think you broke me, the guard said, his voice still quiet but somehow filling the entire studio. You think you've won some kind of victory by making me move, by making me react. Whoopi's eyes narrowed. And what's that supposed to mean? But you haven't broken anything, he continued. You've simply revealed something about yourself that everyone in this room can now see clearly. The guard's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. It means that for the past 15 minutes, you've been attacking a man who hasn't said a word to defend himself. A man who came here as a guest on your show, to share something about his culture and his service. I was just having fun, Whoopi said, but her voice sounded defensive now. The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Were you the guard asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looked like you were trying to humiliate me for the entertainment of your audience. It looked like you were using your position of power to attack someone who couldn't fight back. You asked me what I think about Americans who make fun of our traditions, the guard continued. Here's what I think. I think most Americans are better than that. I think most Americans understand the difference between good-natured teasing and deliberate cruelty. The silence in the studio was deafening. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and everyone in the room could feel their impact. So here's my question for you, the guard said, his voice still quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. What kind of person uses their platform to attack someone who can't defend themselves? But you, he said, his eyes never leaving Whoopi's face, you crossed a line today, and the saddest part is, I don't think you even realize it. The guard's commanding officer was watching from the wings, his face a mixture of pride and concern. He knew that his soldier was about to do something that would change everything. Isn't it? The guard asked, his tone remaining calm and measured. Let me ask you something. If I had been a guest from any other profession, a teacher, a nurse, a firefighter, would you have spent 15 minutes trying to humiliate me? That's not what I was doing, Whoopi stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Whoopi stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as the guard's words echoed through the studio. The audience was completely silent, and even her co-host seemed at a loss for words. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it felt like the entire show had been turned upside down. That's different, she said weakly. You're a symbol, you represent something. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Whoopi looked around the studio seeking support from her co-hosts, but they were all staring at her with expressions of growing discomfort. I represent service, the guard replied. I represent duty, honor, and commitment. I represent the idea that some things are worth standing for, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. He paused, letting his words sink in. What do you represent, Miss Goldberg? The question was like a slap in the face. Whoopi's eyes widened, and she took another step back. Around the studio, crew members began to whisper among themselves. The audience was completely captivated, watching what had become a masterclass in dignified confrontation. I represent speaking truth to power, Whoopi said, but her voice was shaky. Do you? The guard asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you represent using power to attack those who can't fight back. It looks like you represent the worst kind of bullying, the kind that hides behind humor and claims to be harmless fun. The guard's commanding officer was watching with growing amazement. He had never seen his soldiers speak like this, with such authority and moral clarity. This was a side of the man that even he hadn't known existed. People expect you to be better than this, the guard interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying more force now. They expect you to use your platform responsibly. They expect you to treat your guests with human dignity. You don't understand, Whoopi said, her voice becoming more defensive. This is entertainment. This is what we do. People expect. He gestured to the audience. Look around you, Miss Goldberg. Look at their faces. Do they look entertained? Do they look like they're having fun watching you attack me? I didn't mean, she began, but the guard cut her off. You didn't mean to what? To spend a quarter of an hour trying to break down a man who came here in good faith, to use your position to attack someone who couldn't defend himself, to turn what should have been a respectful cultural exchange into a one-sided humiliation. Whoopi turned to look at the audience, and what she saw made her heart sink. The faces looking back at her weren't laughing or smiling. They looked uncomfortable, embarrassed, and in some cases genuinely upset. The guard's voice was growing stronger now, filled with a righteous anger that was impossible to ignore. The words hit Whoopi like physical blows. Her face had gone pale, and she seemed to shrink into herself. You want to know what I think about people like you? He continued. People who use their power to attack those who can't fight back. I think you're cowards. I think you're bullies. And I think you hide behind your success and your platform because you're too weak to face real challenges. But I'll tell you what's meaningless, he continued. What's meaningless is using your platform to tear down others instead of building them up. What's meaningless is mistaking cruelty for humor, What's meaningless is thinking that your success gives you the right to attack anyone you want. You stood there and mocked my service, my commitment, my way of life, the guard said. You called me meaningless, empty, a toy soldier. You questioned my worth as a human being. His voice was shaking now, but with controlled emotion rather than weakness. You asked me earlier if I ever wonder if my life has meaning, the guard said. Well, I do have meaning. I serve something bigger than myself. I protect something that matters. He paused, his eyes locked on Whoopi's face. The studio was dead silent. Even the sound technicians had stopped moving, afraid to break the spell of the moment. Can you say the same? Whoopi started, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in her career, she was genuinely speechless. The question hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Whoopi's face cycled through a range of emotions: anger, embarrassment, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. The guard stood perfectly still again, but now his stillness seemed to come from strength rather than discipline. You want to know why I didn't break earlier? The guard asked, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. It wasn't because I'm a robot or because I'm empty upstairs, as you so eloquently put it. It was because I was taught that when someone attacks you with words, you don't respond with anger, you respond with dignity. But there comes a point where silence becomes complicity, where allowing someone to attack you without response becomes permission for them to attack others. He gestured to the audience, many of whom were now looking at Whoopi with disappointment rather than admiration. His voice grew stronger, more commanding. Whoopi's co-hosts were staring at her now, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Joy Behar had covered her face with her hands, while Sarah Haynes looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. You made this personal, the guard continued. You attacked not just my profession or my traditions, but my worth as a human being. You did it for entertainment, for laughs, for ratings. You did it because you thought I couldn't fight back. But here's what you didn't understand. I wasn't staying silent because I couldn't respond. I was staying silent because I was giving you the chance to be better than this. I was hoping you would word what you were doing and stop. You want to know what discipline really means? The guard asked. It's not about standing still or following orders blindly. It's about knowing right from wrong. It's about standing up for what matters even when it's difficult. The guard's commanding officer was watching with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew his soldier was about to cross a line that would have consequences, but he also recognized the justice in what was happening. The silence in the studio was complete. Even the audience seemed to be holding their breath. He took a step closer to Whoopi, and she instinctively moved back. It's about treating others with respect, even when they don't deserve it. It's about being better than your worst impulses. It's about using your power to lift others up, not tear them down. You asked me what goes through my mind when I'm standing guard, the guard said. I think about the people I'm protecting. I think about the values I'm representing. I think about being worthy of the trust that's been placed in me. His eyes never left Whoopi's face. What goes through your mind when you're sitting in that chair? Do you think about the people you're influencing? Do you think about the responsibility that comes with your platform? Do you think about being worthy of the trust your audience has placed in you? Because right now, the guard said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying throughout the entire studio, I'm looking at someone who has forgotten what it means to serve others. I'm looking at someone who has confused entertainment with cruelty, humor with humiliation. Whoopi's face had gone from pale to flushed. She opened her mouth several times as if to speak, but no words came out. He paused, and in that pause everyone in the studio could feel the weight of judgment. And the saddest part, the guard continued, is that I don't think you even realize how far you've fallen. I'm looking at someone who has lost their way. The words hit Whoopi like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for her chair for support. The audience was beginning to murmur now, but it wasn't the comfortable chatter of entertainment. It was the uncomfortable buzz of people witnessing something they weren't sure they should be seeing. Whoopi's eyes filled with tears, but whether they were tears of anger, shame, or something else entirely was impossible to tell. The guard straightened to his full height, and for a moment he looked every inch the soldier he was supposed to be. You want to know what I really think about Americans? The guard asked. I think most of them are better than you showed yourself to be today. I think most of them understand that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. But you, he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute judgment, you chose to be small. The guard's final words echoed through the studio like a thunderclap. You chose to be small. 4 simple words that somehow contained more power than all of Whoopi's attempts at humiliation combined. For a long moment, nobody moved. Whoopi stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them looking ashamed of their earlier laughter and encouragement. Instead, I learned something about the difference between true strength and the illusion of power. I learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with words and character. Finally, the guard spoke again, his voice returning to its earlier calm tone. I came here today to share something about British military tradition, to show your audience what discipline and service look like. I thought it would be an honor to represent my country on your show. He paused, and the silence felt heavy with meaning. You asked me earlier if I ever break character, the guard said. The truth is, I wasn't playing a character. I was being myself, a man who believes in service, in duty, in treating others with respect and dignity. Whoopi wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but she still couldn't speak. The guard's moral authority had completely overwhelmed her, leaving her defenseless in a way that no amount of training could have prepared her for. His eyes swept across the studio, taking in the audience, the crew, and Whoopi's co-hosts. But you, he said, looking directly at Whoopi. You were playing a character. You were pretending to be someone tough, someone who could break anyone down with words and laughter. But characters aren't real, Miss Goldberg, and when they come up against real conviction, real principles, real strength, they crumble. The guard's commanding officer stepped forward slightly, perhaps sensing that his soldier was about to go too far, but the guard held up a hand, stopping him. I'm not finished, he said quietly. Whoopi looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. He turned back to Whoopi, who was now sitting heavily in her chair, her head in her hands. You want to know what my one line is, he asked. The one line that's going to shut down your whole studio. Here it is, the guard said, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. The difference between us is that I serve something bigger than myself, while you serve nothing but your own ego. That's it, the guard continued. That's the one line that explains everything that happened here today. You spent 15 minutes trying to tear me down because you couldn't understand what it means to build something up. You attacked my service because you've forgotten what service means. The words hit the studio like a physical force. Several audience members gasped audibly. Whoopi's co-hosts looked stunned. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze in place. He straightened his uniform with precise movements, every gesture deliberate and controlled. I'll continue to stand guard, Miss Goldberg. I'll continue to serve with honor and dignity. I'll continue to represent something worth defending. His eyes locked on hers one final time.